College football non-conference scheduling needs fixed. The voice of college football does it next. Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, looking at the game we love. If you love college football, you're a hardcore college football fan, you have found your new home right here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, where we break down the game, discussion, debate, and analysis like no other each and every day. This has long been a problem area in college football for decades, for generations, forever. Non-conference scheduling. It needs to be standardized. Here are the issues. It's a very broken system, much like the college football playoff. We address that elsewhere. Every team, every program has an agenda. They are allowed to carry it out. This happens in no other sport on the levels of the professional ranks with the NFL, the Major League Baseball, the NBA, and the NHL. Can you imagine those teams going out and scheduling their own games 12 and 14 years in advance? Why would you do that? It's not necessary. There's no reason to do it. All right. It creates imbalance. If there's a sport that needs equitable, balanced scheduling, it would be college football, because what the College Football Playoff Selection Committee is charged to do is basically compare teams that have very little overlap, if any overlap in scheduling. They have to compare teams from all the 5 major conferences that did not play each other. And by extension, they have to compare the conferences, is what they have to do. They have to determine the strength of each conference. How do you do that when the scheduling is so imbalanced? All right, so the first thing you need to do is go to a 9-game conference season, so everyone is playing 3 conference games. Right now in the Big Ten, the Pac-12, and the Big 12, we have 9 conference games. Therefore, we only have 3 non-conference games. In the ACC and the SEC, you have 8 conference games. Therefore, you have 4 non-conference games. That creates imbalance. Also, ironically, those are 2 of the 14 team leagues, the ACC and the SEC. That means that they miss more teams in their own conference, 5, than all the other conferences. That creates another problem that we deal with elsewhere. Conference scheduling, that is screwed up as well. But we deal with the non-conference scheduling here. Consider in 2019, or 2018, that is. No, actually, this is in 2019, this fall, that Stanford and Washington, 2 chief competitors for the Pac-12 North Division, and we understand that these games do not play into the division championship, but these are teams that compete for the same division championship. Therefore, their non-conference opponents, the severity of those games, the toughness of those games, the physicality of those games play into the health and the readiness of those 2 teams the rest of the season. Keep that in mind. And also, they're playing for a college football playoff position ultimately and possibly. Stanford this year plays these 3 non-conference games: Notre Dame, UCF, and Northwestern. They are playing Notre Dame, a team that went undefeated last year and made the college football playoff. That should be a top 10 to 15 team again this season. They play UCF, a team of 25 consecutive wins before losing by 1 score to LSU in the Peach Bowl last year. The best, by far, group of 5 program the past 2 seasons. And they play Northwestern, who went to the Big Ten championship game and beat, in the Holiday Bowl, the Pac-12 runner-up in Utah. So Stanford has to deal with Notre Dame, UCF, and Northwestern. Washington, again, their chief rival in the same division, competing for the same championship. They get away with playing BYU, who went 7-6 against one of the weakest schedules in the country, Hawaii, a marginal group of 5, and Eastern Washington and FCS. Those 2 schedules cannot be compared, but they have to be compared, and the 2 teams battling for a championship in that Pac-12 North Division play those 2 schedules that there's no comparison between the 2. Look at South Carolina and Tennessee in the SEC Eastern Division. South Carolina out of conference, in addition to a brutal conference schedule. South Carolina plays Clemson, the best team in the country, defending national champions, North Carolina, another Power 5. Appalachian State, one of the quality Group of 5 teams that has won 3 consecutive Sun Belt championships, and Charleston Southern. Tennessee plays the aforementioned BYU. That's their toughest non-conference game. UAB, a marginal Group of 5. Georgia State, a lower portion Group of 5, and Chattanooga. So, again, 2 division foes. South Carolina has to play Clemson, North Carolina, App State, and Charleston Southern. 3 quality opponents. Tennessee's best opponent is BYU, UAB, Georgia State, and Chattanooga. There's no comparison between the 2. There are a ton of examples like that. I just choose those 2. Consider that last season, 2018, the Pitt Panthers played Notre Dame, Penn State, and UCF. Out of their 4 non-conference games, they played Notre Dame, Penn State, and UCF. Meanwhile, Alabama, arguably the best team in the country, the supposed number 1 throughout the season, their toughest game was against Louisville. They played 4 non-conference games against Group of 5 and FCS opponents and 1 against the Power 5, and that was Louisville, one of the very worst teams out of the 64 in the Power 5, 2-10, 0-8 in the ACC. Meanwhile, Pitt plays Notre Dame, Penn State, and UCF. A top 5 team, a top 15 team, and another top 10 team. In 2019, I mentioned the Stanford schedule that's brutal, non-conference, Notre Dame, Northwestern, and UCF. And keep in mind, since they play 9 conference games, those are their 3 out-of-conference games. Therefore, Stanford plays no gimmies. Their 1 gimme would be Oregon State. So that's the Stanford schedule out of conference. Compare that to Baylor, who plays Rice, Texas San Antonio, and Stephen F. Austin. Oklahoma State this fall plays Oregon State, Tulsa, and McNeese State. Ohio State, this is embarrassing, and it has to do with a contract that was changed with TCU that took a home-and-home series to a 1-game series played last season. So Ohio State is left with Florida Atlantic, Cincinnati, and Miami of Ohio. That's pathetic. So what do? Well, we first eliminate these contracts that are signed by the schools, and we take scheduling out of the hands of the particular programs. Why are schools scheduling their own games? You need a formula, number 1, and then you need a committee that can best interpret the formula and give it context. So the formula is going to decide about 85 to 90% of my system, and then there needs to be a committee in place that takes the formula and steers it toward better matchups. So first, let's touch upon the schedules. The schedules as they are currently constructed, where just a few days ago you had Georgia and Florida State signing up to play each other. That's great. 2 power programs playing each other. I'm all for it. But these games are going to be played in 2032 and 2033. It is 2019. Why do games need to be scheduled 14 years in advance? The NFL, Major League Baseball especially, and the NBA have much more complicated schedules to deal with. Many more games, especially Major League Baseball. The complexity of that schedule compared to a college football schedule. Schedule the games, schedule the next season during the off season. The games do not have to be scheduled 10 and 15 years in advance when everybody's sitting around making excuses for schools saying, well, they didn't know that they weren't going to be any good in 5 years. They didn't know that they weren't going to be any good in 10 years. Lame excuse. Let's bring it in-house. Let a neutral, unbiased system determine the non-conference scheduling. All right, again, it can be done. And also, this would give more publicity and more fanfare, more attention to college football, because like the NFL, you would have a schedule release date that would be anticipated by college football fans. May 1st. May 1st, schedule release for college football 2019, and even people that were educated on how the system worked would still be waiting to see how exactly was the committee going to use the system. I'm getting to the system right now, but can you imagine a college football schedule release date? That would be huge for the sport. So exciting. All right. Sometimes when I explain my scheduling system, people will say, yeah, it's like an NFL scheduling system. No, it's not. Other than it's a formula, that's how it's like the NFL schedule. But the NFL is trying to create parity, much like their draft, the NFL draft, the NFL schedule is to create parity. So every team in the NFL plays everyone in its own division twice. So that's 6 games. And then they play a designated division in the other conference. Every conference in the AFC, every division in the AFC plays an NFC division. So that rounds out the other 4 games. So that's 10 of the 16 games are set. And then the NFL has a scheduling formula which determines the other 6 games for each team. And it weights the games. It weights the records and the teams placed on the schedule based on the previous season standings. So the New England Patriots, the Super Bowl champions, will have a more difficult schedule than the Cleveland Browns, who only won 6 or 7 games, because they're trying to create parity, give tougher schedules to the better teams, give weaker schedules to the lesser teams. Therefore, it will create parity, just like the NFL draft. There's nothing fair about the worst teams drafting first and being rewarded for being pathetic, and the good teams, the great teams, drafting at the bottom. It should be randomized, actually. But again, the NFL is trying to create parity. I'm not trying to create parity. I'm trying to create an even, fair playing field. So this is what you do. Again, you go to a 9-game conference season. That means you're playing 3 non-conference games, everybody in the Power 5. So basically, you allow the teams to play one Group of 5 or FCS opponent. The other 2 games have to be played against Power 5 opponents. Those 2 Power 5 opponents are determined based on the previous year's standings. Yes, you cannot predict. There are teams that get better. There are teams that get worse. So in the aftermath, not all the schedules can be equitable because nobody can see into the future. But at least they're based on something that is equitable. And it's last year's record. And this is where the committee comes into play as well. So everyone in the Power 5 is going to play 2 Power 5 opponents. And those 2 Power 5 opponents will have a composite conference record from the previous season of what? 500. That can be achieved. Because if you take everybody's conference schedule from the previous season, obviously it adds up to 500. Okay, this can be best achieved if you take Notre Dame, BYU, and the other independents and you put them into conferences, but that's another matter. I have worked this out with Notre Dame, BYU, UMass, New Mexico State, and Liberty and Army playing independent football. Then their records from the previous season have to be tabulated and estimated as a conference record, and then you slot them appropriately. So, again, you've got everybody playing a 500 composite schedule of those 2 Power 5 opponents. Okay. We're going to keep all the traditional matchups intact, like the ACC against the SEC. Louisville, Kentucky, Florida, Florida State, Georgia, Georgia Tech, South Carolina, Clemson. Iowa, Iowa State, Big 10 and Big 12 play every year. That will remain intact. But think about it. Iowa and Iowa State fans in particular. Do your teams ever play anyone in the Power 5 other than playing the other school? Therefore, you have a very boring schedule every year. Iowa fans know we're playing Iowa State, great, but then we're going to play 2 MAC schools. And Iowa State fans know we're going to play Iowa, but we're going to also play an FCS and a MAC school or some group of 5 school. They never, except for Iowa a few years ago playing Pitt home and home, never play anybody else in the Power 5. Well, this wipes this out. And now Iowa and Iowa State fans can look forward to playing another Power 5 opponent. Wouldn't it be nice if Iowa State fans were able to play Stanford? Or play North Carolina, or play Nebraska. And Iowa fans can look forward to playing Miami, or Mississippi State, or Kansas State, or somebody else besides Iowa State every year is the only Power 5. All right, so we're going to maintain the rivalries, but there's another Power 5 game in play. All right. Other attractive matchups can be scheduled, maybe not on a yearly basis annually, but on a fairly regular basis. Michigan, Notre Dame, Michigan State, Notre Dame, Pitt, Penn State, Texas, Texas A&M, Oklahoma, Nebraska, because the committee will have to work within the metrics of creating that composite 500 opponents schedule, but they can also use their brains to try to devise attractive matchups. All right, so there it is. I have done this before. I've gone through the entire Power 5. It's easy to do. It's not easy to do, but people much smarter than me that work on schedules can do it. So every team in the nation will have a composite 500 schedule. So for example, let's take Ohio State. Who are they going to play in their 2 Power 5 non-conference games? Well, let's say we select that they're going to play South Carolina, who went 4-4 last year. Well, in our system, once it's implemented and plays out, South Carolina will have either a 5-4 conference record from the previous season or 4-5 because everybody's going to play 9 games. So let's say South Carolina went 5-4 last year. Ohio State's other opponent will be a team that went 4-5. They'll have a composite 9-9 record. Oklahoma, let's say we want them to play USC, who went 4-5 last year in the Pac-12. Well, Oklahoma's other opponent is going to be 5-4 to balance it out at 9-9. Everybody's going to play 2 opponents who have a total win-loss record from the previous season in conference play of 9-9. That obviously can't be achieved the first season because there are 8-game seasons for the SEC and the ACC. But you get the point. There it is. That will create a scheduling balance. You will no longer have Stanford playing 3 really good teams and Baylor playing nobody, 3 weak group of 5 opponents. That's ridiculous. Take the scheduling out of the hands of the particular teams with their own agendas. We don't need to schedule games 15 years in advance. It can be scheduled during the offseason. It's equitable. Again, the committee has to work within the metrics. So the metrics are going to decide most of this, and then the committee can tweak it to try to create attractive regional matchups. And then we have a big schedule release date, May 1st, let's say. Bam, college football's front and center May 1st, when everybody's forgotten about college football and they're worried about the NFL schedule or the NBA playoffs. Voila. The college football schedule comes out, and nobody's going to be able to have a clue. They'll have a clue as to what the matchups could be, but they're not going to know until it's released on May 1st. All right. That's our solution to non-conference scheduling in college football. Would love to hear what you have to say right here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football.